So hello, everyone. One second. Hello, everyone. My name is Amit Zehavi, Director of the Partnership between Yoav Regional Council in Israel and Lehigh Valley, Pennsylvania. Partnership Together is a program that connects over 550 Jewish communities around the world. 43 there are 43 partnerships connecting all these communities. And a lot of them are in North America. We also have South Africa and England and some other places around the globe, but the majority are in North America. The idea is to connect volunteers, people-to-people connections, and we do this through a variety of programs. This is one that I'm especially proud of. We're going to have a program today that's going to create a lot of things to think about. And I want to welcome everyone for joining today, and I would like to wish you a meaningful experience. Thank you very much.
You forgot to mention Holland. Nurit, hello, Nurit.
Yeah, hi, how are you, Micha?
Very well, thank you.
Good. Well, I'd like to say hello to everybody also. My name is Nuri Grossman. I am a member of Kibbutz Galon and, of course, a member of the Regional Council of Yoav. We are partners, for which we're always thankful. And today I would like to start off by telling you about Zipporah Horovitz, who is the mother of Shlomit Horovitz that we're going to meet in a few minutes. And Zipporah, who was born in 1933 in Hurubuszu. I'm having trouble saying that, sorry, in Eastern Poland, to a well-to-do Jewish family, and she had two older brothers, Nathan and Shalom. Her family owned a flourishing shoe business, and as Zipporah tells in her book, Forbidden Strawberries, she was the beloved and perhaps a little spoiled princess of the family. When the war broke out in 1939, Zipporah was not yet 6 and had been in school only 2 weeks. When the children in the school taunted her with cries of, "Jew, go back to Palestine," her parents were afraid to send her to school and hired a Hashomer Tzayir youth movement leader who knew Hebrew to teach her. At the beginning of the war, Zipporah's life was a happy one. She played only with Jewish girls, all of whom were dead by the end of the war. Most were gassed to death in the Sobibor camp or one of the other death camps located near her town where she was born. From the moment the Germans entered the city, the violence they brought with them could be seen from Zipporah's window. The Germans left the city 10 days later as part of the Russian-German Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The Red Army had several Jews serving with them and who replaced the Germans for a very short while, and they had several Jews working and in the army. And they tried very hard to convince Zipporah's family to flee to Russia, but Zipporah's father insisted on staying to look after his shoe shop and property. 2 weeks later, the Germans returned, and thus began the reign of terror, which would last until the very last days of the war. Starvation, terror, fear, the loss of families, the death camps, all these were faced daily by a little girl who somehow found the wits to survive right up to the last forced march from Majdanek, one of 10 children out of hundreds who survived. Zipporah, after the war, came to Israel and came to live in Kibbutz Galon. And on her grave in Galon Cemetery is written, "Hitler wanted to kill me when I was 8. After the war, I built a new life in Israel. I have a devoted husband, 3 wonderful children, and a supportive community. I am now 78. I won. I think these pictures have told us a lot about Zipporah, in addition to what we discussed at the beginning. And now I would like to introduce to you Shlomit Horowitz, Zipporah's daughter. Zipporah was a Holocaust survivor. And we all know that the number of Holocaust survivors is going down through natural causes and through maybe all they suffered from the war. And the focus is on the children of the Holocaust survivors. How do they feel about what happened? How do they feel about the future? How do they feel about whether they have any obligations? So we're going to start with Shlomit. And Shlomit, could you tell us something about yourself and your family?
Well, I live in Kibbutz Kfar Menachem, also in the Yoav Regional Council by chance. I was born in Galon, the same kibbutz that Nuri lives on, and where my mother came after she married my father. I have 3 children, and that's all I have to say about myself. But in regard to my mother, I think part of the reason that I was asked to speak was that I think I have a different view than people expect of a second generation survivor, I guess. And that is that in most families, the survivors didn't want to talk, didn't want to tell their stories. They kept it a secret. They sort of started a new life in Israel and wouldn't go back to what they left behind. With my mother, it was just the opposite. And I was the opposite. I was the one who didn't want to hear her stories, who didn't want to deal with whatever they meant to me emotionally, for various reasons that really I can't explain, I guess, not even to myself, but that was that. And also the fact that my mother married an American made a big difference, I think, in my life, in the fact that until my mid-20s, I really never felt like a second generation Holocaust survivor. I think that's when I was in my mid-20s, which is about, unfortunately, 40 years ago, that's when the talk in Israel started with a lot of second generation, people. Books came out, plays came out, and people started being able to talk about their experience and what it was like to grow up in a family that the parents were survivors. In the beginning, I didn't really relate to it. I really felt that I grew up in an almost normal household, and I had a sister with a chronic disease, so I can say definitely that affected me more than my mother raising us as a survivor. It's not that I didn't know, but I didn't give it any emphasis, and I thought that all the obvious, signs that came with it, like anxiety, like a feeling that there's something dark in the house and there's a secret. I didn't feel all of that. But later on in life, I did start realizing that some of the things did concern me, and part of me bears the weight of the fact that my mother is a survivor. By the way, my name is Shlomit, and I'm named after my mother's brother, whose name was Shalom, and was killed right in the beginning of the war. So it's like I feel that just by being, I'm a testimony to my mother's wish for a new life. And I think that was heavy enough without dwelling into her story on top of it all.
Shlomit, you're older now. Yeah, you're no longer an 18-year-old teenager. And do you think, from the hind point of looking back and so on, that today, is it important for us to make sure that the story of the Holocaust and the lessons from the Holocaust are passed on? And who should pass them on? Do you feel that you, as the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, have any sort of obligation to make sure that people know about it? And is that obligation any bigger than somebody who has no family connection with the Holocaust?
Well, first of all, of course, I think that, the legacy should go on. At least in Israel, one of the headlines in the newspaper today was that every fourth Jew in America had some kind of an account with anti-Semitism in the past year. So that is very, very worrisome. I feel that I should have the obligation, but I think in regard to what I said before, it's hard for me to act upon that obligation. And I've always felt like something's stopping me from doing anything like with it. But it no less means that I think that, something should be done. Any kind of racism, anti-Semitism, or the war that is going on in almost every continent in the universe, of course, should be avoided. So yes, but I guess I do have the obligation, but I don't feel that I can live up to it. If I'm being honest.
Yeah. Did your children feel the same way as you? I mean, were they interested in hearing their grandmother's story?
Yes, I think, the relationship between a grandmother and her grandchildren is not the same. And there's no tension like there was, I guess, between me and my mother. Always the daughter-mother relationship is not the same as a grandmother-grandchildren relationship. So they were prepared, to listen to her, and they were prepared. First of all, they all three of them went to Poland, to the concentration camps. My son Amir, who's an officer was an officer in the Israeli army, went with the army once, and with his, officer uniform, stood where my mother was rescued and told her story to the other officers along with him, which was, of course, I thought of my mother at that time and how proud she would have been to see her grandchild, who's an officer in the Israeli army, coming, like a strong Jew from a strong Israeli country, to tell the story of her her survival story in Poland. Of course, that's very meaningful. And I think it's easier for my children, of course, to, my mother's been dead for nearly 10 years. So, my youngest daughter's 21. So, it would have been, a long time ago for them, but they did listen to her and were prepared to hear her story.
Shlomi, was your mother, Tzipora, was she upset that you weren't interested in hearing her, in listening to her?
Of course she was.
Did
on
you
one
talk about it between you?
I remember one conversation. My mother used to give talks in high schools and also in the army every Holocaust Day in Israel, which is in April. She was a very sought after speaker for this purpose. And on one occasion, after one of the talks, she came to my house to visit her grandchildren and everything. And then, you know, she said the kids asked me what my personal kids thought about my story. And sadly, I told them that my personal children are not interested in my stories. And I just said, Ima, that's the way it is. And I didn't elaborate. And I know that it upset her, but I guess she couldn't do anything about it. And I, you know, even at that point, couldn't say, okay, I'm ready to listen and I'm prepared to hear your story. It's something, it's like all of a sudden, I guess you're asked to be your own parent and like be their protector and be stronger than they are for them. And I felt it was, you know, sort of too heavy for my shoulders. Maybe. It's sort of maybe one explanation, but you know, it's something that I was so strong, I felt so strongly about that even her facing me and asking me, telling me the story and asking her to, you know, to tell me the story, I couldn't even bring myself to do.
Did you ever feel that you wanted to go with her to Poland, to the camps and so on? You know,
again, no, my husband and my 3 children are still planning, you know, when the COVID is over to hopefully go after my mother's roots in Poland. And they'll have a big job convincing me to do it, but all 4 of them are really willing and wanting to do it. And I'm still not sure it's something that I can do. Honestly, it has never, if they wouldn't have brought it up, I wouldn't even think about it. It's not something I wanted to do. Maybe it will happen one day, I don't know, but they'll have a big job convincing me, that's for sure.
Shlomi, just another question. Over the years, certainly in Israel and other parts of the world, there have been delegations of school children to Poland, to the concentration camps, as part of a way of educating towards the future. On the other hand, there are people who are against it, saying that, yes, well, we'll simply, you know, putting a lot of money into the hands of the Poles. How do you feel about those, you know, the school children going?
I think it's very important, but I had 2 different experiences with my children. My oldest daughter went with a delegation with Tzafit High School. And of course it was touching for her because she came, you know, with her grandmother's personal story. And when they were in Majdanek, which is the camp that my mother survived at, she also read the part of the, you know, in the book that, no, the book wasn't out yet, but she told her story then. But my 2 other children went with the Hashomer HaTziyun Youth Organization to the camps. And I felt that they did a much different kind of preparation towards the trip to Poland, with the emphasis on heroism and Jews not being taken as lambs to the slaughter, but rather than putting emphasis on, you know, the strength of the Jewish people, the emphasis on the rebel at the Warsaw Ghetto, and the aspect was totally different. And I think the preparation that my kids got through Hashomer HaTziyun was much deeper and more meaningful. And also the fact that not the whole, you know, age group went, but only people who really actually wanted to go with Hashomer HaTziyun went with Hashomer HaTziyun. And I think the attitude should be changed to the fact that not the whole of the, you know, group of, let's say, 12th graders from Tzafit should go, but they should put an emphasis to the people who are really willing to go there and understand it, and not going on a shopping spree in Warsaw, but they're going for a specific reason and are ready to, you know, open their minds and souls to the anguish that, the Jews suffered in Poland. So I think they should go, but I think the aspect of free will should be as part of the, terms of them going.
Mhm. Is it really the responsibility of the Jews to educate about the Holocaust?
Well, it's hard for me to say because I live in a Jewish country, so of course I'll say yes. It's very difficult for me. Maybe Tama can say something about it, or Shari, but I really hope that they would teach the Holocaust studies in the United States. I don't know. I left the United States at 7th grade, so of course we got none of that in my Jewish school, but I hope so, but I don't know how it is.
Yeah. Just one more question for the moment. We always used to say during the war, which I barely remember, you weren't even born, that at that time of the horrors of the Nazis, had there been television, had there been modern technology, had we seen these things in our homes, then it could never have happened. But over the last few years, we have watched Rwanda, Croatia, and other places, and I think we've seen that there's something that makes people behave as they do, regardless if anybody is watching them. Does that mean, in your opinion, that the education about fascism and so on is something which should bother everybody?
Yeah, of course it should. I don't know if most of the people listening to us are Americans, but I think, the last few years in the United States have shown us how important, teaching people about tolerance and anti-racism is so important. It affects us and it affects them even more so with all the hate crimes that happened in the States over the last few years. And, whether it's Asians or, Blacks or Jews or whatever, but of course, yeah, we always, I would like to think that everybody wishes for a peaceful world and that our problems should be maybe ecological and not like human, but unfortunately the world goes on and, unfortunately history hasn't taught a lot of people a lot of things, and it just repeats itself, whether it's in the form of anti-Semitism or like the countries that you just mentioned, what's happening in Myanmar now and in China with the Uyghurs, there's hatred and there's, I don't know why. I just can't explain, why. I mean, I can hate you on a personal basis, but the fact that people are so prejudiced just because you're a Jew and you represent something is incomprehensible to me.
Do you feel differently now about our responsibility for continuing to fight and educate about the Holocaust than you did 30, 40 years ago?
Yeah, when I was younger, I think other things worried me. Now I'm at the point where, I'm much older, my kids are much older, and, I would like to leave a peaceful world to them. Yeah. When you're young, other things really sort of are on the top of your mind. But today, I would like my children not to go through what my mother went through and what other generations had gone through, and all the wars in Israel, which, I would be glad to get rid of and not have my, my children go to wars, and my grandchildren eventually, if I'll have any. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Shlomit, and we'll come back to you after I think Tamar has spoken to us as well.
Before we continue, I just want to welcome everybody here on behalf of partnership with the Lehigh Valley and DOAV. I'm Sherry Spark. I'm the coordinator for the Holocaust Resource Center. I'm wearing a mask because I'm here in Temple Beth El. I'm actually in a room right here with about 20 young people who are watching this along with all of us. So that's why I'm masked, and I apologize. I hope you can hear me okay. I just, before Tama, I throw this over to you, I just have a couple of words about why we're here specifically today. This week marks on the 27th of January, International Holocaust Memorial Day. This date, January 27th, was selected by the United Nations only 15 years ago. I'll let that sink in for a minute. 15 years ago as a date to mark the Holocaust. And that particular date is picked because it's the liberation of Auschwitz. And it was chosen as a day for us, specifically for the world, to remember that 6 million Jews and 11 million other victims were at the hands of the Nazis were victims at that time during World War II. While our Jewish calendar has had Yom HaShoah for many, many more years, it's officially on the calendar since 1959, designated by the State of Israel. These days are very much, or I feel like they're very different. Yom HaShoah is truly a memorial day, a day for us to remember victims of the Shoah and heroes of the Shoah. And International Holocaust Day has a somewhat different focus. It's a way for the world to not only mark those horrific events, but also a way for us and in the world to recognize that these types of events, as Nuri was sort of guiding the conversation before, it's a way for us to mark and recognize that these types of events can do and will happen in the future if we are not vigilant. In a way, what we observe today is much more of a way to educate, to take that classic saying that, if we don't remember the past, we are doomed to repeat those mistakes. So the next part of our presentation will be to explore the idea not only of memory of the Holocaust, but of the legacy and responsibility of that memory, and with not only hearing stories, but also the idea of Holocaust education. What are our roles and responsibilities moving forward? And it's for that reason that I asked Tama Tamarkin here in the Lehigh Valley to join us today. Tama has played an integral role in our community here, sharing the story of her bubby, Judith Ginsburg, who she's going to share a little bit of that story. But beyond that, she's really, truly taken on the mantle of Holocaust memory as a way to educate young people, and not only young people, but primarily she talks to young people in our communities. So with that, Tama, I'll turn it over to you, and then we'll be back together to speak with Tama and Shlomit together.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen, and so you can see who I'm talking about here. These are my grandparents, Judith and Marvin Ginsburg. They are both Holocaust survivors. I'm going to tell you about my bubby's story only because it's the story that I know better, but my Zadie has an equally compelling and heroic story. And I'm going to try to tell the story in a short amount of time, which usually I take a little bit longer, but I want to get to those points that Sherry was talking about. So Shlomi and I can talk about education and the future. But just a few pictures. This is my family with Bubby. This is particularly hard for me. This is the first time I'm sharing her story when she's not here with us. She passed away in October. This is the last time we were all together as a family. Here she is with some of her grandchildren and one of her daughters. This was when she was being honored as a partisan fighter, which I'll tell you about. And here she is as a young girl. My Bubby was born in Lida in Poland, and from the moment she was born, she was actually considered a survivor. She was a twin, and she lost both her twin and her mother in her birth. So she was a survivor from the beginning. She grew up in Lida. She was part of a really special, prominent family. Her mother's family were bakers. Her father was known to help out needy in the community. My Bubby lost her father actually when she was 12, but she had this big, loving, wonderful family. She was raised by her grandparents and a stepmother, and she had really, despite all these difficulties, a pretty happy childhood, which the happy childhood and happy teenage years came to an end in June of 1941 when the Nazis bombed Lida, and she was forced into the ghetto, as were all of the people of Lida forced into the ghetto. In May of 1942, the ghetto was surrounded. All the Jews were asked to come out, and they were separated either to go to the left or to go to the right. My Bubby went to the left with one of her sister's husband, and two of their babies. The rest of her family was on the right. And on that day, the Jews and the people of Lida on the right, 57 members of my family and 5,500 members of the community of Lida were killed, either shot, buried alive, or pushed into mass graves. The 1,800 survivors of Lida then went back into the ghetto, and on September 22nd, 1943, the ghetto was liquidated. They were all brought out. My Bubby was still with her sister and her husband and the two children, and they were marched en masse in lines to the train station. They had no idea where they were going. She looked at, as they were approaching the train station, she looked at a soldier and she said to him, where are we going? Where are you taking us? And he said, you are too young and too beautiful to go where they are taking you, and you should run. And my Bubby looked at her sister, and her sister said, you have to go. One of us from our family must survive this. So at the time she was holding one of the babies, she handed the baby to her sister, and she grabbed a friend of hers, her friend Bluma, who was around her age, and they ran into the woods. And as they were running, they heard shots firing. My Bubby to this day believes that that was the soldier firing shots in a different direction to create a distraction so that she could leave and so she could survive. She and Bluma stayed in bushes that night in the woods, watching the trains go away from the station, watching her only living relatives leave. And interestingly, like Sippora's family, this train was bound for Majdanek concentration camp. So the remaining family my Bubby had were killed in Majdanek, but she did not know that at the time. So here she is, alone and afraid, with her friend. They decided to walk to a nearby village. They found a man, a non-Jewish man. They knocked on the door, found a man who was willing to help them, to take them to the partisans. They knew that there were partisans in the woods who were fighting back. Bluma had a brother who was in the partisans, and they knew that's where they wanted to go. So they found a man who would help them. He actually developed a signal with them that as they were walking, if he took his hat off, that meant there was danger. He walked ahead of them so they could see him. If his hat was on, that meant they were safe. And they were able to find partisans. Bluma was able to join a group where her brother was, and my bubby somehow got herself accepted into a Russian partisan group, mostly of Russian paratroopers. And she convinced the commander, she convinced the partisan group that she knew how to shoot a gun. She was like 18 years old. She obviously didn't know how to shoot a gun, but she lied and she convinced them. And her first night with the partisan group, she stood on guard and she fired shots when she heard noises approaching in the woods. She was petrified, but she fired those shots of warning. And it turned out that the noises that she heard were horses in the woods, horses on the leaves rustling. But she proved herself to the commander that day, and she got to stay with the Russian partisan group. And she was there for some time until there were Poles joining the group, and there actually was increasing anti-Semitism within this partisan group that were fighting against the Nazis. So she asked her commander if she could go join the Bielski Partisans. And the Bielski Partisans, as some of you may know, were a group run by Tuvia Bielski and his brother, and they were a group of partisans in the woods that weren't looking to fight, but that were really looking to save Jews and to find them, to go to the ghettos, to keep them alive, and really to save families. And for the last 4 months of the war, my bubby was a soldier. She fought with the Bielski partisan group until liberation. After liberation, she went back to the town of Lida, where she was from. The town was mostly destroyed, had been burnt, and my grandfather's family, who she didn't know at the time, and he was not my grandfather at the time, meaning he was not married to her, but they were giving bread to Jews in the street who were hungry, and they took her in. She got to know the family real well and ended up marrying one of the brothers, my grandfather, Mutka Ginsburg. From there, they went to a displaced persons camp in Germany where they lived for 4 years. My uncle Howard, who was named Chaim because he was life. He was the first Jewish child born after the war in the Fehrenwald displaced persons camp. And then 2 years later, my mother was born. And then they were able to come to the States, and they were able to, they were sponsored by a family in upstate New York, and were able to somehow rebuild. I just want to share a few more photos, and then I'll turn it back to Sherry. Let's see. This is my bubby and my Zadie. You can see them circled, and my uncle Howard. I believe she was pregnant with my mom at this point, and these are Jews who were remembering within the Fehrenwald concentration camp. My bubby on the other side, my bubby was Judith Kaszanska. That was her maiden name before she was Judith Ginsburg, and this is from Auschwitz. Actually, there's a museum with a book of names, and these are all the people in her family. And the one I circled is Tema Kaszanski, one of her sisters, who I was named for. This is a picture of my bubby towards the end of the war with the Bielski partisan group, and you can see she's only one of 2 women in that photo. She is holding a rifle. She was a soldier with the group. And I like to sort of take this and compare it to the next photos I'm going to show you, but it reminds me of Zipporah's story where she said, you know, they tried to kill us, but we won. So this is my bubby's only family at the time. She lost everyone. And these were the people in the partisan group who became her family. This is what she built. So you can see her in the middle of both those photos. The one on the bottom is my son's bar mitzvah, which was about 5 years ago. And you can see holding our hands up. This was we won. Here we are. We triumphed. So I will turn it back to you, Sherry.
Thank you, Tama, so much. And if we can get also Shalmeet, can we get her on?
Yeah. Here
Yeah, I know.
am.
I'm trying to see if we can get you spotlighted with us. There we go.
Okay.
So I just want to touch on a few ideas and see where we're trying to sort of focus today on where do we go from here. Over the course of the past few weeks, Nuri and I have been speaking, Tama and Shalmeet and Nuri and I have been speaking. We've all been trying to sort of frame the context for this discussion today. So I have a few ideas, and I'm just going to throw questions out there. And then for you all who are sitting out in our viewing audience too, start thinking about questions, because we'd like to make the discussion as much about your thoughts as about ours. One thing that Shalmeet spoke of, and I'd like to sort of compare if we can, is this idea of where are we, how do our two communities, because we do like to explore our two communities together, how do we see and how are we already seeing this idea of Holocaust education and sort of sharing that legacy with younger generations. So Tama, if I can have your thoughts first, and then we can kind of see where you and Shalmeet, I know Shalmeet we heard from already, but let's see what your ideas are, Tama, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so in terms of Holocaust education and sharing the stories, I think for me, I do feel like it is an obligation. And most of the students, most of the people that I talk to are non-Jewish, maybe haven't even met a Jew, let alone heard anything about the Holocaust. And one of the things that I try to stress when I'm talking to young people is that, as we started talking about the Holocaust survivors, most of them are not here with us anymore. And we, as people listening, as people learning from us, they bear witness. And by bearing witness, they then bear a responsibility to tell the stories. So it's something that's really important to me for that reason, so that they can hear from a grandchild of a survivor, so it becomes real, so they can see those photos, and also as a legacy to my bubby, who even the last time I saw her in July, we were in the hospital, and she she kept telling the stories, and I had to remind her, Bubby, I know your stories, I talk about your stories, but even in her last few months, that was the most important thing to her, was that we knew, so that we could pass that on. So I intend to continue to do that as best as I can, even though it's not fun. It's hard for me. It's not an easy thing to talk about, but it's important.
And Shalmeet, I'll ask you this question too. Do you feel as if there's, we don't really know what happens in each other's communities on an intimate level or detailed level, but do you feel like, either of you, that there seems to be a fundamental difference between what is taught in Israel versus what might be taught in America? And not only that, but culturally, who it's taught to and why. What is the reason? What are the differences in the reasons that the Holocaust must be taught?
Well, the big reason, the number one reason, is us living in a Jewish state, or mainly Jewish state, I should emphasize. And the fact that the Jews after World War II have managed to build a safe place for the Jewish people is the most significant thing. And I think because of that, there's a huge difference probably in the education of, Jews in Israel and, students in the United States. Here it's emphasized throughout the last years of high school, plus the almost obligatory, trips to the concentration camps in Poland and all the preparation that they go through during their 11th and 12th grade. And also in Israel, don't forget, I mentioned this in our earlier talk, on the Holocaust Day, which is in April, there's a siren going off at 11 o'clock for 2 minutes or 1 minute, and the whole country stands still. Buses stop or the cars stop in the road. You can't avoid it. Even people like me, let's say, want to, close their eyes to whatever it means, that you can't avoid it, no matter what you're doing. And you have communities, mostly kibbutzim, so we all have our ceremonies on the day before Yom HaShoah at 6 o'clock, which is, of course, symbolic to the 6 million Jews that were killed. So you can't live in Israel and totally be oblivious to the, to the Shoah. It's like in the blood, it's part of the culture, it's part of our being here, so. And in America, you have, it's a totally different kind of culture, and you have to put a much stronger emphasis on being a Jew, or the meaning of what racism is about, and hatred and everything. So going back to your first question that you asked, Tama, I think education is the basis to change people's minds and thoughts. But again, I worked with babies. I didn't have to deal with it on the kibbutz. But I think somebody will definitely have the answer as to, new ways that the children can relate to, except for what Tama does, of course, being an eyewitness or second witness to the stories, but that somebody should come up with a way to get through to people's minds about the atrocities that are being done in the name of, God, religion, supremacy, white supremacy, and I wish I had the ability to think of a, educational plan. I don't, but education is definitely the basis to change people's thoughts and minds. It's the number one important thing.
Tama, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think here in the States, when we think about education about the Holocaust, I think about two things. I think about educating our Jewish children, which right now Shari has a group of them in the room with her at religious school. And, that happens one way, but then there's also the education of the non-Jewish students. And that's what I do mostly. And when we do this, we talk about the Shoah, we talk about the Holocaust so that they can learn about the history and so that they can bear witness, as I talked about, but we also use it as a tool to teach them about standing up. So for example, in the story I just told, I would tell it in more detail, but we would discuss who in that story maybe stood up and we use a word called upstander, who was an upstander that helped somebody survive. And how can you apply that to your life when you see discrimination or racism happening, anti-Semitism with Jews, with non-Jews, all different kinds of scenarios. So the Holocaust is used as a tool to really help students learn skills so that they can apply them to their own lives.
Sorry, I'm trying to transfer my students out of here, so I'm like giving hand signals off to the side. The one thing I wanted to point out also is that, and we had this discussion in my classroom this morning before as a preparation for coming in here, is there's a very different way for our students here in Jewish settings to approach learning about the Holocaust? Like, what is their motivation for having to study the Holocaust versus going into communities where there are no Jewish students and really trying to teach that story? And this idea that learning about the Holocaust as a Jewish person carries with it a much heavier obligation, because we're the ones who are taking that story forward with us as part of our story. So I guess a way you can think about it is with American history, in general, history is just something that we have that moves us ahead into the future. But Jewish history in general, I think, is something that we move forward with. It links us to the past. You know, this past Shabbat, we read the Serah Dibrot. And one thing that we're taught is that we all stood at Sinai together, whether we were actually living or not. All the generations stood at Sinai. And I think that idea has sort of contextualized Jewish history for all of us, that just because you weren't there doesn't mean it's not part of you. And I feel like that's one of the things as an educator, to Jewish students, whether we're here in the States or in Israel, whether it's something that is in the air all the time, or you're only just learning about it, that the knowledge about the Holocaust has to feel like it's a personal story to a certain extent. And then the lessons that we take from it also become personal. I think that that's an important point to make. And I think that that's a commonality that we share between our two geographical locations, regardless of how we come to learn about the Holocaust. So if this is a history that's going to evolve, because history just does evolve, there's no way to avoid that. How we perceive history evolves. How do we make this story work? And I feel like at this point, maybe we can open up the discussion a little bit. How do people in our audience also feel about it? And do you have any questions? If we think about this as a universal story, that can appeal to a broader community, why is it important? How do we continue to share the story? And I look forward to your ideas. I think the easiest way, by the way, to share, if you want to share, would be to use the raise your hand function, because that way we'll see who's actually there. Although I do see someone raising their hand. I see Judith, then Michael, you're muted. If you can unmute, you can take them, but hold on one second. I see Judith, then Michael, but I can't hear you because you're muted. Are people able to unmute?
They unmuted now.
Is it okay? It's okay.
We hear you.
Okay. I would like to share, as I told you, my name is Micha. I'm from Kibbutz Gat. It is a near kibbutz to Nurit, and Nurit was my English teacher, and because of it, I'm speaking so well English. Nurit, thank you very much.
Welcome.
Anyhow, I want to relate to things that Nurit mentioned, about the second generation, because we are now the second generation. And what is our obligation? Do we have obligations? Sure, we have obligation, of course, because our parents are not anymore, and they are not able to tell the story. And we are the one who are able to tell the story, and we should do it. It is our obligation to the other Jews and to the rest of the world. And that's what we are doing now. Very simply. I'm very simple, I mean. I can tell something about my family. Most of them was murdered in the Second World War, not in a concentration camp in the Danube, in the Donau, in the Razzia. They were shot, and their bodies floated many, many kilometers, and the river was red. So a story like this, of course, I have to tell, but it's a very difficult story to tell, of course. And I can tell you about my family. I never heard from my father almost nothing about what happened, because he didn't want to bother me. I didn't want to bother him, asking him. So we didn't speak about it, very simply. And then he died from a car accident in Israel, and never told me anything. So I had to find the story myself, and I found it, and I wrote a book about it. And then I did my part of my obligation by writing the story. Yes, but it's not, of course, not enough. I should tell it to my children, and they should tell it to their children. And we are doing it. That's the story. We are doing it. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. That was, first of all, it was incredibly moving. And I feel like that's exactly where I see passing on the legacy as being so important, is that if we just stop sharing the story, that's where the story ends. I don't know if anyone has a thought on maybe what the difference is between, I hate to use the word, I don't know how else to frame it, but a survivor telling their story has a very different perspective and a very different point of view and a very different reason for sharing the story, as opposed to someone who's a second or third generation. And now we're even starting to see here fourth generation survivors tell their stories. What do you feel like those differences might be? How do they, why are they even important? And I'm just, these are just
yes.
musing.
My daughter came to me and she told me, if you are not writing the story, nobody will know it, and it will be forgotten forever. So this is the reason I wrote the book. Then I have my grandchildren. How should you tell your grandchildren such a terrible story? I asked you. It's very difficult because I have a few, more than one now. The oldest one is very, very interested and wants to hear those terrible stories. His sister, she don't want to hear anything about it because it's frightening. So it's very different, and I can tell you so. My daughter told me to write, my son is an actor in Holland. He's busy with those things almost every day, and he writes about it, and he acts about it, and he tells about it. So, I mean, about my family, we are doing the right things. That's it.
Yeah, you are. Lauren, I see your hand is up.
Hi, I'm sorry I had to join a little bit late this morning, but I thank Tama for sharing her story. It's so impactful, and we should continue to tell our stories, but I really connected to this topic of, continuing to speak up. I also went through exactly the same thing as the gentleman who just spoke. We never talked about it in my house, ever, ever, ever. My grandparents never talked about the Holocaust. We knew what they had gone through, but they never talked about it. And it's still very hard for my dad to talk about it. So I just agree in continuing to speak up as much as we can about as much as we know. I think, they'd be very proud of us to continue their story because they endured really the unimaginable and, according to them, really the unexplainable. So I just thank you for holding kind of conversations like this. And I know, Sherry, we used to speak a lot, and I know Tama was involved in the Youth and Prejudice Conference, and hopefully things like that will continue again in the future, because I think getting out our stories is more important now than really it ever was. So, but it's difficult when you kind of grew up not talking about it so much. So you're just continuing speaking about what you know. And sometimes I fear that the real story isn't getting out 100%, but we just have to keep going and keep sharing and keep educating.
Lauren, thank you. Judy Schulman, I see you have a hand up.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, thank you. Boker Tov Shlomi. Long time. Raised as an American Jew without any knowledge of direct descendants who were murdered in the Holocaust, even still, I felt it was very important to teach my son about this as a Jew and as an American. And I remember when he was younger, a point when he felt like he was on Holocaust overload, like he didn't want to hear any more about it. Why am I trying to show him movies? Why am I trying to make him read books? Why is everything about victimization? And for him, it was just a small part of who he felt he was, and he wanted to push it aside. And the reason I think it's so important to tell these stories from survivors, children of survivors, and grandchildren of survivors is because the point at which my son made his turnaround was when he was talking to his Zayda, my father, who not until very late in his life, Alav Shalom, disclosed that he was present at the liberation of Dachau. And that was the point at which my son made the connection that it is a personal story for all of us as Jews, and our obligation to educate not only ourselves, but others in a social justice manner, but also because the stories are personal and they're real. And the thing that concerns me most quite recently is the number of states and cities and school districts in America where they are now trying to suppress information and present it as if it is a neutral topic, as if all perspectives are equal and valid relative to fascism and Nazism, and it's not okay to put values on this or judgments. So I think it's very important that we speak up and tell our personal stories. Without it, it's lost.
Thank you so much. Sandra Greenfield, I see your hand is up.
Yes. You had asked recently, where do we go from here? What should we do? Unfortunately, I don't have a good sense of what is already being done here. So I don't know what, there's no point to make a suggestion that you've been doing since 1970. So that's part of my problem here to answer. I think something that I'm really working on now myself is to try to recognize what are the elements of making up what are the elements that brought forth a Nazi regime? What are how do I recognize that kind of society in the future and recognize it early on? Am I making myself clear? I don't know if I'm okay.
Of course,
That's
yeah.
what's I think important. And
So,
I think that applies to any kind of society. Yes, my own, you know, our people's history, but also in general.
you know, you're asking for an answer on the head of a pin. But I'll tell you that in terms of what goes on in this community, you know, the HRC spends a lot of time going out into schools. I mean, this is prior to COVID, of course, where, as Tama was saying, most of the students that we came into contact with had never even spoken to a Jewish person before. And it's incredibly important, especially living in a society where Holocaust education is not necessarily mandated, that we need to make sure that the proper information is being disseminated, and that you know, that the more students have a contact with that story, as opposed to looking at a paragraph that they in the United States will have a paragraph in their history book about the Holocaust, the more people we have touched. And you just don't know how your stories, if you have a Holocaust story in your family, or if you've listened to a Holocaust story and can share that story, you have no idea what the impact will be to somebody in the future. So it's incredibly important. And, you know, the impression that I have from Israel, and you guys will just correct me if I'm wrong, is that students there and just living in Israel, you feel like it's something that you know already just by living there. But I think there has to be really more of a serious thought about awareness about the Holocaust and sharing and preserving those stories, especially for young people, because they are the next generation that's going to have to share them. We're unfortunately a little bit ahead of Israel with that, because we have fewer, especially in our community, we have fewer people to share those stories. And we're starting really seriously grooming young college age students to share their grandparents' stories or great grandparents' stories. Carol and then Faye.
Hi.
Hi, Carol.
Hi, good morning. It occurred to me that when we look at the Jews in Israel and the Jews in the US, the Jews who are living in Israel are living in a country that became a country as a result of the Holocaust, although it was there before, it wasn't a country per se, but it was recognized after the Holocaust, whereas the Jews living in the US now are living the exact same way that Jews were living in Germany at the onset of the Holocaust. My point being that the Jews of the diaspora have a much bigger, I think, responsibility or burden, or however you want to call it, to keep the history going and to, you know, and to keep it close and personal. But this is in conflict with the rising data that many Jews and young Jews don't value their identity as Jews. So, you know, it's a bigger problem. It's a big problem. And I think going forward, especially for Jews in the diaspora, we have to look at it in the context of where we live in order to be successful at how we keep this going. And I would like to thank your speakers today and for you for putting this program on, which I think should be aired and discussed with all young children. But if I really am pleased to have seen the two different opinions and to understand both of them equally. So thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Faye?
Hello, good morning, good afternoon. I feel so connected to all of you on my screen. Shlomi, thank you for what you shared. I am a second generation as well. I also came from, in a nutshell, my mother and her sister survived, and her brother miraculously lost their parents and many family members, but my mother talked about it every day. And I, like you, tuned it out. I didn't want to hear it at all. And when my mother passed away 11 years ago, my friend Tama found out that I was a child of Holocaust survivors and was determined to get me involved. And I didn't want really to be involved at all in telling their story. And I said, slowly, I said, okay, well, let me go with you to see what you do. And maybe I'll tell a little bit. And slowly I did that with Tama. I went with her a few times and told a little bit, bits and pieces of my mom's story. And, you know, I tuned it out, but I tried to get it down on paper after a while from what my cousins could remember and my brothers, and put a story together. And then Shari helped me fine tune it even more so. And I do find it very rewarding to go out there when I can to talk about what happened, in the hopes that it doesn't happen again, or even spark one person to make a difference in the audience, because it is, like Carol said, it's so on the rise, and it's scary to see what's happening today. And when I was younger and my mother would talk about it, I would say, just stop. We're in America. It's never going to happen again. You're wrong. And now I see every day the things that are happening, and I follow a lot of social media sites, and to see the things that are happening all over the world, I have her in my ear saying, it could happen again. It's slow, but it'll happen again. And I don't know what to do about it. Like, I try to make my little marks with my community here, but it's scary. And Shari, I feel like over the last 2 years with COVID, our programs have kind of gone away. Like, I haven't done it for a while, and the anti-Semitism just keeps coming and coming, and the things that I hear, and why aren't we doing it anymore? And why can't we do this kind of thing via Zoom? Because I don't know, it's just, I feel like it's going away, and it needs to be out there, and with even more things that we could do. I don't know what it is, but at least our stories. And that's it.
Thank you, Faye, for everything you've done in our community. And don't worry, we're working, we're operating in the background, and hopefully we'll be back in person with stuff more so this spring. So I'm going to conclude by asking Nuri to share a few final thoughts. I just do want to say again, thank you to everyone for joining us today. And we really appreciate the participation of everyone who planned this program, everyone who presented, and all of you who joined us. Nuri?
Yeah, thank you. I would like to add, if I may, a few thoughts concerning the reason why we had this program together. It wasn't just by chance that we said, well, it's the International Holocaust Day, so let's do it together. I think that one of the reasons that we decided to do it together was because we're in a sort of unique position. We have the good fortune, first of all, to be in a partnership that I think we've found to be very rewarding and very exciting, and we've done a lot of good things together. And I think if we're talking about Holocaust education, this is a unique opportunity too, because in Israel, just because we're a Jewish country, and as Shlomi said, some things are automatic, but I don't kid myself at all that if we don't make every effort to do something about continuing Holocaust education, I'm not sure. We have young people who are going to Poland to buy dresses. Can you imagine that? Young people, our second, third, fourth generations, are going to Poland because it's cheaper to buy clothes. Can you even imagine that? I can't. It makes me sick when I think of it. But it's one of the things we're going to have to face. And I think those are the kind of things we're going to have to face together, because together we represent Jews and non-Jews and Americans and Israelis. And I think that we have to look further. It's quite clear to me that fascism is rising, anti-Semitism is rising, and it's not far away. And for Jews, we have to make sure that we are not threatened again with a Holocaust, but we have to do it because other people are threatened with their own little Holocaust too. And I would love to see as an outcome of this broadcast or getting together, that we actually, as our communities, get together and think, what are we going to do as communities who affect not just Israel and not just America, but people in general? How are we going to put our 2 cents in there so that everybody who thinks, and I listened with great appreciation to the people from Lehigh Valley, because I realized what I knew, I think already, how deeply involved you are. And I have a plea both to you and to Yoav. It's not our private little problem. It's a problem that is, unfortunately, in my opinion, going to grow. And I would love to see some sort of communications between us, whether it's making plays together, whether it's preparing, I don't know. We have to think about it. But I think we have to, and I know that Shari's doing wonderful work with her students and the program she has, which means that we have the capability, we have the talent, we have the care. And I would so much like to see this go beyond the boundaries of Partnership 2000. To all of you who took part, to everybody who spoke, it was such an honor and such a pleasure. Thank you so much, and I hope we'll get together on more such things. Thank you.
Thank you.